My friends, I warned you at the beginning of my speech that my message was going to be unpleasant. However, I also want to bring you a message of hope. Because if Muslims would be able to liberate themselves from Islam, they would be able to achieve great things. And I have often been in the Middle East. Before 7 years that I have this protection now, I was able to visit the Middle East, and I visited almost every Arab and Islamic country many times. And I know the potentials that people, the Muslims living in those countries, actually have. And they should have. Look at the prosperity of Israel, which has the same climate, which has the same geographical conditions as most of the Arab countries. Though Israel has no oil fields, the Israelis have built a prosperous, a democratic and a free nation. If only the Arab countries could liberate themselves from Islam, I'm sure that they too would be able to become more prosperous and free nation. And they would be able to achieve things that they and the rest could benefit from. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why that probably won't happen, is once again Islam. And we should not be afraid. We should not be afraid to say honestly that the problem is Islam. We have had enough of political correct politicians. Islam is the problem. Like I said, my friends, I'm not a pessimist. We can still turn the tide, but we have to act today. And in the Netherlands, my own country, we are going to roll back on the Islamization process. The current Dutch government is a minority government which can only survive by the backing of my party, the Party of Freedom. And we decided after tough negotiations last summer, a few months long, to support the government. But in return, we demanded and we got measures to be taken to prohibit certain aspects of Sharia law. We have achieved, as the Party for Freedom, for instance, that the Dutch government will ban the burqa and the niqab. We have achieved that there will be a restriction of immigration from non-Western and Islamic countries by 50% in 4 years' time. We have achieved that if people keep committing crimes in the Netherlands and they have a double nationality, that we strip them of the Dutch nationality and send them packing back home. So it can be done. It can be done. And apart from expressing our solidarity with those who are persecuted by Islam, there are 4 measures. I will tell you shortly which one I'm aiming at. There are 4 measures which we, and I also hope the Canadian government, will take. The first is that we must always speak the truth. Because the truth will set us free. We must defend freedom of speech. We must tell people without fear what is at stake. And in Western Europe and also in Canada, freedom of speech is being restricted today at the demand of the Friends of Islam and their collaborators, and enough is enough. We all know the case of the brave man Ezra Lavant that spoke to you before here in Canada. Last week, the Danish journalist Lars Hedegaard, president of the International Free Press Society, was fined by a court, by a criminal court, because he had criticized Islam. In a private conversation, without knowing that his words were being taped, he had called for the attention for the horrific conditions of women in Islamic society. And recently in Austria, Elisabeth Sabadic-Wolf, a human rights activist, was fined by a criminal court for calling the Islamic prophet Muhammad a pedophile, which, as you know, is true because he consummated in marriage a 9-year-old girl. And meanwhile, at the same time, my own trial is continuing in Amsterdam. And as you probably know, despite the fact that I'm an elected member of the Dutch Parliament, representing more than 15% of the voters, I have been brought to court in my own country on charges of hate speech for telling the truth about Islam. And my trial is not merely a political trial. It's also an unjust trial. The decision of the public prosecutor not to prosecute me, because that was the first decision, was overruled by the court, which issued a direct order to prosecute me, saying that I'm already guilty of incitement of hatred and discrimination, found guilty before the trial actually began. And this legal charade will not, however, even if they send me to 500 courts, prevent me from saying what needs to be said. The fact that we are actually being treated as criminals for telling the truth must never deter us. We are doomed. We are doomed if we remain silent or let ourselves be silenced. We have to get rid, ladies and gentlemen, of our hate speech laws that actually are only being used against people who are critical about Islam. Europe and Canada are in desperate need for an equivalent of American First Amendment, which guarantees the freedom of speech. Freedom is the source of human creativity and development. People and nations wither away without the freedom to question what is presented to them as the truth. Without freedom of speech, we risk becoming slaves. Frederick Douglass, the 19th century black American politician, son of a slave, said, and I quote, "To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker." My friends, we do not want to become slaves. And 65 years ago, as I said, young, brave Canadians in the battle against Nazi Germany offered their lives for a free Europe, for a free Netherlands. And it would be an enormous insult to them if we Europeans would give up that precious freedom for another totalitarian ideology called Islam. This will never, ever happen. So our first and most important obligation, defend the right to speak what we see as the truth. And secondly, we must end cultural relativism. We must proudly complain. Don't be afraid. We must be proud to complain that our Western culture based on Judeo-Christian and humanistic principles is far superior than the Islamic Catholic. Only if we are convinced of that, we will be willing to fight for our own identity. We must defend our Judeo-Christian civilization if we do not want to be swamped by Islam. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we must stop the Islamization process. More Islam means less freedom. More Islam means less democracy. We must stop the immigration from Islamic countries. There is no other thing to do. We must expel criminal immigrants. The second thing to do. We must, because Islam is, like I said, more an ideology than a religion, we must forbid the construction of new mosques in our society. We must close down all Islamic schools. We don't want young children to be educated in ideology of hate and violence. Ladies and gentlemen, there is enough Islam in our societies already. And last but not least, fourth, we must once again take pride in our nations. Patriotism is a virtue. As Canadians, you must cherish the culture and identity of Canada like I should cherish the culture and identity of the Netherlands. You must demand that immigrants accept Canada's values and not the other way around. You and I, Canadians and Dutchmen, we belong to a common Western culture. We must stand together, side by side with other nations in the West. We must rely upon each other and help each other in the struggle against a common adversary. If we want to preserve our nations, our homes, and pass our Judeo-Christian heritage on to our children and grandchildren, we must stand together. My friends, we will stand together. We will stand firm. We will not submit. We will never submit. We will survive, and in the process, we will stop Islam. We will defend our freedoms because we stand for the truth, and the truth will prevail. Thank you very much.